Good afternoon and welcome to Dateline New Haven. I'm your host, Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make Connecticut tick and New Haven tick. And nobody makes both those places tick more than our guest today, State Senate President Martin Looney of New Haven. Another session has ended. A lot happened. And as we do every year, Senator Looney is going to help break it down for us. Hey, Marty, thanks so much for coming in as usual.
Great, Paul. Great to be with you again.
Always like to mention you were the first guest ever on WNHH-FM back in 2015, and it's great to have you back.
Good to be continuing.
So, Marty, another session ended in Hartford. You were right in the middle of it as the State Senate President. Overall, how'd the session go, legislative session?
Overall, I think it was a really, really good session. One of the things that we were able to do was to increase the progressivity of our state income tax. That's been a struggle since the original income tax was adopted in 1991 at a flat 4.5%. That was out of necessity because at that time I was in the House, and the votes were there in the House to pass a more progressive income tax, but not in the Senate. Until then, Senator Bill Nickerson, the Republican senator from Greenwich, came forward and said he was willing to support income tax, but only a flat rate one.
And that's because Lowell Weicker was the governor, and he had this odd coalition, right?
Yes.
He did have an urban base. He had taken the Democratic vote away running as an independent, but he also came from Greenwich, and he was a pharmaceutical heir, and those were his people too.
That's right.
So there was this criticism that the middle was cut out, that the rich benefited by having this flat tax.
So many of them did, because at that time we had a capital gains tax that was probably 7% plus for the wealthy. So some of the people whose income primarily comes from capital gains actually got a tax cut, but it was by taxing all income at 4.5%. But again, that was the deal that had to be cut because the then Democratic leadership in the state Senate, there was one vote short of being able to pass it with the Democratic vote, so it had to be drawn to Nickerson's specifications, and that was. And then for the last 32 years now, we've been trying to build more progressivity into the income tax after starting with that flat rate, and we've succeeded by at various times creating different tiers of income tax at different levels. And I think what we did this year was probably a very significant progressive move in taxing the lowest rate of income at that had been taxed at 3% will now be at 2%, and the next tier at 5% will be taxed at 4.5%. So while we weren't able to get the governor to agree to add a tier at the upper end, to go from 6.99 to maybe 7.5 at the upper end, or establish a separate tax on capital gains, we did establish greater progressivity and give relief to low-income taxpayers.
It's been interesting to watch you wage this fight over the years, Marty, because you're always got to run into political reality. You have to count enough votes to get something passed. You mentioned what happened back in 80, and that happens every year. So let me tell you how that looked to me, Marty, from the sidelines. So Ned Lamont is a Democratic governor, but his motto was Weicker, right? He always says Weicker was the ultimate governor. He's really a Fairfield County Republican before Republicans turned MAGA. And he said, no matter what, we're gonna cut taxes. Nobody's gonna raise taxes. He's not gonna be Bill. I thought he was just doing that for re-election, but no, he's doing that for good. He's saying, I'm a guy who doesn't raise taxes, and you and many Democrats, especially from cities, have been arguing for years that it's unfair that the very wealthy in Connecticut, when you count state and local taxes, pay something like a third as much in their taxes percentage-wise than a bus driver, than a teacher, than a cop. So you've been trying to whittle away at it, but you got to work with a governor from your own party who's unwilling to count the rich, to make the richest of the rich pay just a little more in taxes. So you're working within those constraints.
Right.
So you're
exactly
telling me
right.
that you want a big victory by giving the tax break to the lowest of the low. And it seemed to me that there was no other option for you. Looking at on the sidelines more broadly, I wonder how a Democratic Party led by a person who's unwilling to tax the rich the same way we tax middle class and working class people, how there's ever going to be a more fundamental fix to the tax system, because you do need money to run government. So if tax cuts are what are championed, and they are because of what you're working within, are you ever going to have enough money to run government? Is the solution to tax unfairness just cutting taxes for more and more people, or will that create unfairness for those same people by limiting government's ability to deliver?
Well, that's our challenge. On the other hand, businesses were complaining that they didn't like the tax cut that we agreed to with the governor because it only affected individuals. They wanted to see more tax cuts aimed particularly at business. And the CBIA and others said, well, there's really not that much in this for us. And they were criticizing the governor and the General Assembly for not doing more business
and do the
taxes.
Democrats, and again, this isn't your position, this is the position of people like Lamont, Are you playing into the Republican game by competing for who can cut taxes more? I mean, Clinton did this too. Clinton was constrained with the Republican Congress, right? So he couldn't. Only way he could help the poorest was by doing the earned income tax credit. That's what you did here too.
Yes.
In an environment of tax cutting, and Rosa did this too, the Laura in Congress. You have no other option if you want to help the working middle class and the poor than to cut taxes for the poor rather than raise taxes on the rich. Long term, are the Democrats, I'm not criticizing this because I don't have to run for office, I don't have to pass laws. Those of us who are on the sidelines wonder whether in the end the Democrats should have fought a more fundamental battle to instead tax the rich, or whether you have to accept reality year by year because these are real people's lives.
Well, the fact is that the governor would not have signed a bill
Right.
that raised income tax on the rich, and we didn't have the votes to override it. The House clearly didn't, because they didn't even have 2/3 of Democrats, and they have a very large and substantial moderate caucus of approximately 20 to 23 members. So on some of these issues, they would have trouble getting to 76, let alone to 101. I believe in the Senate we could have passed a number of other progressive measures, but not by a veto-proof margin. And for instance, we were able to pass the paid sick days bill in the Senate, but the House didn't take that one up. So again, we're, as you said, we're operating under the constraints of what will the governor sign, and is there anything that we could get to 24 votes and 101 to override? And this year there was not.
So, I mean, I'm not at all criticizing what you have to do day to day. I'm wondering,
Right.
So is the strategy, I know you do a lot of work on election years, supporting certain candidates. Is the answer that you legislate what you can get year to year, and then on election season you really work hard to support candidates who will support tax justice?
Well, yes, we have after the 2016 election, when we were tied 18 to 18, we have increased our strength in every election since then. We went to 22. We had a big jump in 2018 to 22 senators, 23 in 2024 in 22. So we have made progress. But again, we have to deal with the reality that we have a largely suburban state. There are probably only 10 senators who represent districts where they would get almost no pushback from a tax increase on the wealthy. Everyone else has, at least has some significant elements of suburbia in their districts. They look at it, the three most needy cities, New Haven, Hartford, and Bridgeport. That's only 6 senators out of 36. And in fact, even those 6 also represent other towns. Like I represent Hamden, Senator Winfield represents West Haven. The Bridgeport senators each represent, one represents Stratford, the other represents Monroe and Trumbull. The Hartford senators represent Wethersfield and Bloomfield and Windsor as well. So, that's the reality we're faced with.
There's also
here.
the framing challenge you have. Because I think, tell me if you agree with this, you started in state office in 1980. That was also the year we elected Ronald Reagan.
Right, that's right.
Would you
81.
agree
Yeah,
with-
the 80 election was my first state rep. Yes.
Would you agree with me that changed the framing of this debate to this day? Because of being pegged someone who raises taxes, that has become a way you cast Democrats as being against the everyday person, even if what you're really pushing is to shift the burden from the everyday person to the ultra-worthy. Would you agree with me that not just in Connecticut, but nationally, Democrats are wrestling with how you combat that image? Like Lamont has been firm. I'm never going to be called someone who raise taxes, even if what I did was raise it on the top 1% and raise it lower everyone else. Is that the challenge?
That is the challenge. The messaging challenge is that that people often, even those people who often would benefit from greater state support, greater state aid, especially greater municipal aid, because it would help lower property taxes. Even those people say, don't raise taxes. So I was at Dunkin' Donuts some time ago, and a guy buttonholed me, and he said, you got to do more for the elderly. You've got to do more for the poor. You got to do more for the disabled. You got to do more for the people who are who need assistance from home health care workers. You got to do all those things. And by the way, don't raise any taxes.
So tell me about that conversation. What did that tell you, that conversation?
That
About
told
how
me that
things are
people
framed.
have, in many cases, an unrealistic view about the realities of government. And it points out that government services are, in fact, popular and broadly supported, but raising the revenues to pay for them is not.
Is that new, or is that exacerbated by what Reagan ushered in?
Oh, I think Reagan accelerated that, I think, because of the president, of course, has the bully pulpit more than anyone else.
And he also rode on the coattails of a very effective messaging movement. A lot of the right-wing foundations funded by billionaires watched what Ralph Nader did in the 60s and 70s, where he created nonprofit advocacy groups that framed issues, got us environmental regulation, for instance, consumer safety, protection. They said, we got to do that too. And there were all these foundations like the Olin Foundation, others, that Heritage Foundation, that I think did a lot of the groundwork for Reagan and have pretty dominated the debate since. I think they've gotten better at convincing the average person in America that taxing the rich hurts them.
Oh, I think that's right. And a lot was done, not only Reagan, but then the Bush administration after him. You had 12 consecutive years of Republican presidents before Clinton, who was certainly moderate and was somebody who was sort of a third-way Democrat, was not really a firebrand progressive advocate. And then 8 more years of George W. Bush after that. And then, of course, Obama only had a Democratic Congress in the first 2 years of his first term. When he got the affordable.
And the focus was on Obamacare.
Yeah, and the focus was on Obamacare during that 2 years. And then after that, he was stymied by a Republican Congress after 2010.
You're listening to Dateline New Haven. Have the pleasure today of having State Senate President Martin Looney of New Haven as our guest at 103.5 FM, live streamed at newhavenindependent.org. So another thing on the sidelines, and those of us who aren't at the Capitol sometimes forget how hard it is to pass legislation, how many years it takes, what you need to shave off a bill in order to get over the stick line. You got some stuff over the finish line this year that was really hard. When I'm looking at it, tell me if these are among what you think are the highlights. For years, we've been trying to get red light and speed cameras to catch speeders in New Haven. Permission from the state to do it in a way that we want to do it. We had permission to do it a different way. And that it was really Democratic interest groups that were part of the opposition to that. We got that passed this year. Baby bonds, you guys had passed the law, and the governor went and funded. The Democratic governor went and fund setting aside $11,000 to the poorest babies born to claim when they're 18 years old to use for housing or job or college. You got that over finally, and you got another gun control bill over to ban open carry and to close the loophole on assault bans. Were those three of the biggies, and how did you finally get them over this year when they hadn't passed other years?
You're right, Paul. They were absolutely three of the biggies. I want to give a particular credit to Representative Roland Lamar of New Haven, who was the House Transportation Chair. Did a great job on that, along with Senator Cohen from our 12th district along the shoreline. And that was a challenge because in the past, as you know, there had been seemingly momentum in that direction, but it had always been opposed by groups that said that this is just a money grab and a gouge. It's going to take money from low-income people. It won't really be focused on safety, but only on a money raiser. But I think the way this year's bill was constructed, I think it allayed a number of those fears that the price of the ticket will be lower, and the money that's collected will not go into the municipal general fund, but will have to be used for transportation infrastructure
And it also
purposes.
incorporates some of the concerns about in some of the racist states where they used it as a way to just pile up fees on people of color, that it's going to be reviewed after a couple of years.
Absolutely. So there is in fact, a review date in it to see whether it is accomplishing its goal. So that was one that.
How about baby bonds? That amazed me. That was passed, and a governor who was born with a lifetime fortune that he inherited from a Democratic Party was blocking funding for something you passed.
Yes.
To have the poorest kids have a little bit of money to have some of those same advantages. How did you deal with that? What was happening behind the scenes with the Senate leadership?
The governor was, his argument was that the benefits of that were so far out in the future that he would rather support things that would have a sooner benefit, a quicker benefit. But I think that our treasurer and our legislative leadership were were really focusing on the fact that the poor kids who would benefit from this, who were born on Medicaid, and the one way of trying to give them some fund, like an inheritance that middle class kids might get when they're in their teens or 20s, would be to set up this fund that would invest a little over $3,000 for every kid that's born on Medicaid, and it would grow to at least $11,000 or $12,000 by the time they were 18, and if they didn't access it until later in their 20s, it could be larger than that. It just seemed to be a way of building wealth among those who don't have wealth, who don't have inherited wealth, and often are not. But
you had already passed that. It wasn't funded. So one of the governor's concern was that he didn't think he should bond for it. And one thing he's done well is to prove our fiscal condition, our fiscal ratings, and partly that's not by running up bonding. Was he right about that? Was it better that you found a different income stream for it?
Well, I think it was better that we found that the treasurer was able to identify a different income stream and because that took away the controversy of bonding for something that's not a capital expense. Really, it is human capital, but it's not bricks and mortar capital. So I think Treasurer Russell did a very good job in identifying that fund that had been set aside as a guarantee fund when we refinanced certain debt and was no longer needed and could be used for that purpose. So it wound up actually will cost us less than bonding would have in the long term. So I think he did a good job.
So that's an example of how even if people disagree in the legislative process, sometimes having to compromise can produce a better result?
It can, absolutely. It makes you more creative sometimes to find a better way to do things. So that the original concept came from Treasurer Wooden, but I think that Treasurer Russell really helped get it across the finish line in an efficient way.
What do you think about that? So we do have ourselves in a fiscal position in the state that's really the envy, right, of parts of the country, because we have 3 years projecting the future of billion-dollar surpluses. Our ratings have gone up. We've maxed out the rainy day fund. We didn't just use the COVID money to just pay one-time expenses. We've cut our bonding. Is that something you're proud of, or is that do you think that the fact that the Wall Street Journal editorials are praising us for our fiscal management, we had the debt diet for bonding, was that the right thing?
It was for a period of time because we really were in a position that our debt rating was being harmed. I think now we have stabilized to the point that we could afford to do more now for those who are mostly in need, but without really violating the spirit or intent of the spending cap or the other so-called guardrails that the governor talked about. In fact, this session, when we wanted to try to find ways to spend more and perhaps do more on the tax side, and the governor said that he wouldn't violate the spending cap, Speaker Ritter came up with one proposal, and I came up with another. The Speaker's proposal was to set aside some of the additional sales tax revenue that had come in, mostly because of inflation over the last couple of years, and do a revenue intercept to intercept that before it came into the general fund and set that aside for additional spending. And I had proposed that we go back to the way the spending cap was defined prior to the budget deal of 2017, where we had to deal with the Republicans on that, would be to put spending and aid to distressed municipalities outside the spending cap. So we had those two proposals. The Speaker was pushing one, I was pushing the other. We were supporting each other's, and the governor regarded both of those as gimmicks and refused to go along with them. So, but there are, again, there are ways, I think, to honor the spending cap. My own view is that the spending cap can be viewed as two ways. One, as a straitjacket that requires you to ignore essential needs in the present because you've adopted this discipline that's supposed to apply regardless of the circumstances at the time. And the other is to regard it more as a support brace or something that can be adjusted as needed while still providing constraints.
This sounds like the opposite. The argument that calls it a gimmick, those moves, and saying it's too short-term compared to long-term. That sounds like the exact opposite argument the governor was making about baby bonds. He was saying that that's long-term and you need something shorter term.
Right. He was saying that it was too long-term. You think about the first benefits wouldn't accrue until
it's kind of
18 years in the future.
Do you feel like you're dealing with Weicker again? And this is not an insult at Weicker. Weicker really was an independent governor who's part Republican, part Democrat. He dealt with both sides to support what used to be the Republican philosophy of fiscal conservative social liberalism, and that he really was the broker between two parties. He really wasn't of either party. Do you think the same's true of Lamont?
I think it's a very different time because Lamont was, in fact, elected as a Democrat, and Weicker, I think, to his great credit, was willing to support an income tax. I think he was willing to support even a more progressive income tax than the one we actually passed.
Yeah.
Because interestingly, if you recall, Bill Nickerson, who was the linchpin of all that, was elected to the state senate in 1990, and the Democrat
that was his first
he defeated
term.
That race was Ned Lamont, who was a candidate for the state senate.
Isn't that
in
interesting?
36th
So if
district.
Lamont had been there might not have ever been an income tax.
I don't know.
That's fascinating, Marty. At least for nerds like us. Yeah,
there was a three-way race that year. There was the incumbent Republican guy named Benvenuto.
I remember that. Yeah.
He lost the nomination to Nickerson, but ran under Weicker's banner, though ran as a Connecticut Party candidate. So it was
So why couldn't Ned slip in then if the Republicans were split?
It was as I recall, I think Nickerson got about 12,500 votes, and I think Benvenuto got 9,500, and Lamont got 7,500.
So do you think he took from Lamont's vote? Were there Democrats who used to like him? Was he sort of a moderate who got Democratic votes? So did he in fact take the Lamont vote, or was Fairfield County still more
At
Republican?
that time, Fairfield County was still solidly Republican, and more moderate Republican, as you said, not the MAGA Republicans, but they had that strong core of people like
McKinney.
Weicker and Stu McKinney, and they were linking, close links to the New York Republican Party of Rockefeller and Javits, and the moderate party there. But so the what was mainstream Republicanism in Fairfield County was very different back then.
Marty, this term also there was some major bonding, the stuff that isn't usually the subject of a lot of headlines, a lot of debate, that actually is going to benefit New Haven in terms of investing in our city. What were some of those examples in this?
Well, one is there's going to be a major mass transportation initiative, which when it's completed will be somewhat similar to what the fast track is between Hartford and New Britain. At Go New Haven, New Haven will be a hub with buses, express buses going out to various places in the suburbs and providing greater bus
I
access
thought
to
what
bus
it was
transportation.
through our, unless I'm confusing with something else, I thought they were going to have dedicated high-speed bus lanes with limited stops that go from the core of New Haven through central arteries like
Yes, that's right.
Dixwell
They're going out
Avenue
to
to
Hamden and West Haven and other places.
Grand
right.
Avenue, Congress Avenue.
Yep, it'll be express buses to designated.
You know what's so interesting
stops.
about that to me? That is a slam dunk victory for Safe Street people. They said we want more mass transit,
Yes.
more options, more bus. The same week that passed, Oakland had a headline where Safe Street people are against their version of that system. You know why? It's just so interesting. These people getting killed there because where they have the fast lanes that cut into these major arteries, so there was one lane for regular traffic and one lane for these bus lanes. So all these people were driving in the bus lanes and fast and running over people. So in those neighborhoods, they were actually saying the same people who wanted the bus lanes. Sometimes I feel like there are unintended consequences we can never see of everything we try to do to fix a problem. Well, not everything.
No, but I think people who live in middle class neighborhoods where everybody has a car don't realize that there are many census tracts in our major cities where almost half the families don't have cars, so they depend on buses to get to work, and that's been a real challenge for many years. So I think this will help in that regard.
I really like our buses. I think they're clean. I think the drivers do a good job.
They do.
I think,
yes.
I'm glad we're building it up. I like riding the bus.
Yeah, and I think there's $20 million in state funding going into that, and I think there's perhaps $25 million in federal funding going into that overall.
Why is it taking so long? I think it said 2029. Like they're going to start building it in 2026. It really takes 4 years to design it.
Well, I guess it does. That's what the engineers tell us to really get it underway, and of course, then more buses will have to be purchased too.
So those of us on the sidelines really sometimes don't understand that government's harder than you think.
That's right. That's right.
You also said there was money for parks, Marty.
Oh yeah, we had an initiative in New Haven that we were able to get $250,000 for a park renovation plan for the Quinnipiac River Park along Front Street, along the river near the Grand Avenue Bridge.
Remember that when that was the Schiavone Scrapyard?
That was the Schiavone Scrapyard.
I remember in the 80s, that was a mess.
Absolutely, it was in the
there.
70s. And then we finally, that was finally cleaned up and it became that park. And we used to have the Fairhaven Day
it's a great
celebrations
gathering
over there.
place and a good passive kind of hangout
Yeah,
place.
very good passive hand. So that's good. There's going to be money for that. And also some money for Fort Worcester in the Annex, which is really a historic old site. And be $100,000 for a cleanup there, an extra $100,000 for the Annex Little League, another $100,000 to add to money that we designated some years ago for improvements at
Do you
Lighthouse
sometimes
Park.
feel as an elected official who's dedicated your adult life to the negotiation and legislation that that's the stuff that sometimes has the biggest impact on the people who live where you live?
Oh, absolutely,
I
absolutely.
mean, we don't talk about it much.
Several
It's kinda
years ago, I was
interesting,
able to get the funding to renovate the Fort Hale fishing pier, and that really
remember
means
that.
a lot to people. Because there are people who fish there regularly, or
Like, do you drive by there and do you say, "I helped do that"?
yes, absolutely, yes.
Do you ever catch fish?
I do. I used to fish there a lot with my son when he was little, and then later with my grandson before it was destroyed in the last storm. But my young granddaughters go out there now and just walk around and talk to the fishermen and see what they've caught.
What kind of fish do you like?
Well, usually we just sometimes we catch small. We've never really caught the big blues that you can sometimes get there in the fall, but some of the smaller fish, and we usually don't eat them, but just for the sake of catching them, it's nice.
Martin Looney, State Senate President here on WNHHFM Dateline New Haven, talking about the session that just ended in Hartford's General Assembly. So what didn't get over? Every year there's stuff you're pushing. Some gets over the finish line. A lot got over this year. Some doesn't get over the finish line. What's some of the projects that didn't make it?
Well, one was the extending paid sick days. Right now, about 12 years ago, we passed a bill. I think it was in 2012, about 11 years ago, to require employers who have 50 or more employees to provide paid sick days. We were looking to provide universal paid sick days.
I mean, for even like 3 employers?
Yeah, even small employers. So we passed a bill in the Senate that would move toward that, and the House did take it up, and there may be some interest in revisiting that, if not in a special session, in the next session. I think it's important now to move on that bill.
Is there going to be a special session?
There may. One of the things that we're discussing is that the bill to provide, to make Connecticut part of a compact to move its presidential primary date earlier in the process. That was one that didn't get across the finish line either. So as part
Would
of the
that
state,
be with other New England states?
yes, as part of with some other states in the region. So I think we would have to adopt that by September if we were going to make it operational for next year. So that's one incentive for coming back into a special session.
What would be another thing in special session?
Well, if we can get agreement on the paid sick days, that would be another thing that could be added on.
Well, did it just not make it in the House because there's so many bills at the end that somebody needs to push it, or was there not enough support?
I think there was a problem with the moderate caucus in the House.
So would that change with a special session?
It might, because there's been more pressure and advocacy since then. So we'd have to see what.
And it requires no state money, correct?
No, that's right. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting, Marty. What about you? Also had a really interesting mansion tax you were proposing for assessed on properties over $1.5 million. What happened with that one?
Well, that's again the one that ran into opposition. Part of the problem with that is that many people believe, well, you're going to start with mansions, but then you're going to lower it to properties of less value, and people already find the property tax the most burdensome tax they pay. But it seems to me that a mansion tax, and keeping it at a mansion tax, keeping it only at very valuable properties, does make sense because of the fact that the very wealthy, creative people can often find ways to evade taxes. But you can't really avoid the property tax. If you own a property, it's assessed at a certain rate. The mill rate is set on that property. You can hire a lawyer to
get it assessed just below.
Maybe you can challenge your assessment so you come in just below the level where it applies. But one of the other things we're looking at too. I had a bill issue that we did in the Senate, didn't go in the House, but it's going to be studied by the Finance Committee over the interim. Is looking at the fact that for tax purposes, we assess property at 70%.
I saw that one.
Market
that was
value.
Bill 770. I've talked about it in past years because the thing I never understood was why, when we get taxed, our property is assessed at 70% of its value rather than 100. I never understood why that was.
That's right, and there's a windfall for those owners of valuable property in that too. So if you've got, a $1 million house, a market value of $1 million, you're getting $300,000 off that market value, and you're assessed at only $700. But if your house, modest house worth $200,000, you're taxed on $140. So you're only getting $60,000 off.
Do you know anything about
value.
the history about that, Marty? How did it come about?
Back in the 70s, a law was created to create uniform assessments because at that time there were some differences. And from what I understand, the 70 was adopted because it had been adopted in some other states, but also part of the practical strategy was that municipalities wanted to have it adopted at a rate that would not trigger too many assessment appeals, because the closer you got to 100%, the more likely people might disagree and say, well, I really couldn't sell my house for that value. I'm going to,
But that just means they're confused. They're not realizing that their assessment is only 70% of what you're saying the market value is.
Right, but I'm saying, if you attach it closer to the market value, people might object more and say, well, this is a pretty high assessment. I don't really believe my property has that high a market value.
So I'm wondering about the policy reason behind it. So I understand that you're saying people, if I hear you right, municipalities are telling you, we have to fool people and think we're valuing it less than it is, or else they're going to appeal too much. If that's true, that seems like a horrible policy reason. And you're pointing that out by trying to make it up to 75.
Right.
But we'd
like to actually go, I talked to John Funfair about this, and he would like to see it go to 100. And then you really can, I would too, I would support that if we could do it. And that would then, every town's grand list would immediately increase substantially. And then you could reduce the mill rate substantially everywhere. And because we have a tremendous disparity.
But Marty, what I don't get about back in the 70s is the part I never understood. So you've just told me the real reason they did it. They were worried too many people would appeal.
That was one of the reasons.
What was the policy reason they gave that you don't assess a property for 100% of its market value?
I think it was that it was that that seemed to be a reasonable way of pegging a value to something that might be too volatile if you tried to track market value all the time.
But you're still tracking market
You're
value.
still
You're just
market
doing
value,
70%.
but I think it was mostly the political shock people thought they'd get if all of a sudden their assessment went way up.
So it's one of those cases. It's like when you're talking about you want services, but you don't want taxes. You don't want to tax the rich.
Yes.
You're kind of. I feel like when we do politics and government, we sometimes have to not. The people aren't honest. Not you. I'm not talking about you, Marty. I'm saying because you're fighting this. It feels like a very dishonest argument and very disrespectful to people's intelligence by saying you're going to be too freaked out if you know how much your values are going out. So by making it 70%, we're going to make you not as upset, even though the reality is exactly the same. The number of dollars you're paying are exactly the same.
Right,
and
right.
in fact, there's a horrible policy implication in that the wealthy get a bigger break than you do.
Yeah, and we see also in terms of the net grand list per capita in Connecticut, the contrast is so stark that in Greenwich, the net grand list per capita is $700,000, and in New Britain and Hartford, it's $70,000. So, which is why Greenwich can provide a rich array of services and have a mill rate of 10
So
or
there's
11.
another example of how when you're limited by political reality from taxing the rich, you go the earned tax increase. Over the years, you've been limited by how much even the Democrats are willing to go to have honest tax fairness. So you've tried to look at how cars are assessed and say, like tax so that people who have the same car in Greenwich pay less tax than someone who has the same car in New Haven. It seems like you have to work within a box.
Right, and that's another thing we did this year is to continue the adjustment on the car tax that we set the car tax cap a couple of years ago at 32.46 mils. So any community with a mill rate above that for their real property get a break on their car tax. On New Haven's new mill rate, I think, is 37.5, but they'll be paying only 32.4 on the car, so they'll get reimbursement for the state from the difference. It'll really make a huge difference to towns like Hamden, who have a mill rate over 50, but yet they'll only have to pay 32.46 on their
so this
on their
is
cars
all
as well.
kind of a contest between the suburbs and cities about
In many ways,
who's
yeah.
going to have money and power.
Mhm.
And that just like with the ratepayers are trying to portray it in a way where they don't feel they're paying as much. Are we trying to make it easier for suburban legislators not to get blowback from their constituents if we want to have a fairer distribution of wealth and taxation by making it not look the same?
Well, I think you have to be creative in some ways because suburban legislators have very different kinds of constituencies, and in order to elect Democrats from those districts, we've got to find ways to package proposals that highlight the equity without having it be so threatening that people think it's a confiscatory tax, which is exactly what their Republican opponents will say.
State Senator Martin Looney, the president pro tem of the Senate, in state office since 1980 here on Dateline New Haven, talking about the latest legislative session, WNHH-FM. So, Marty, you had some big victories in a previous session that now have been put into place. One of them was cannabis legalization, where we're going to stop getting arrested for owning or smoking or using marijuana. We're licensed people. How's that worked out?
I think that's worked out well. It's still in its developing stages, and I think the state's going to get increased revenue from that as time goes on. But it was necessary to do. So many people's lives over the years had been ruined by convictions for possession of relatively small amounts of cannabis. It's the process, again, like so much, started gradually back with a bill to decriminalize certain small amounts of cannabis and other drugs. That was one that Tony Harp and I, when she was in the Senate, introduced after a law passed, or after a referendum question passed in Massachusetts, decriminalizing possession of small amounts. So we decided that, well, public opinion in Connecticut is probably very similar to what it is in Massachusetts. So we introduced that bill. The first year it only got a public hearing in the Judiciary Committee. Governor Welch said she would be opposed to it. But the next year, 2011, we introduced it again. Dan Malloy was behind it, and we passed it, and it became law. So that was how we began to move toward what our current law is on marijuana.
Well, now, one of the goals was social equity, they called it, which is people who are most harmed by the drug war, communities of color, people arrested, lives turned upside down, get the opportunities to make the money on this legalization for licenses. How has that worked out? I know the Social Equity Council, I think the head of it left. I think it was Andrea, right? Comer, was it who was running it? And she left, and in New Haven, we had some arguments where people of color were denied licenses. Have there been issues with that, or are those just hiccups in getting it right?
Well, I think it requires constant vigilance, because what we've seen in other states, because we were not one of the original adopters, I think we're in a position to view what happened in some other states where you had people of significant wealth coming in behind the supposed social equity entrepreneur who was really being funded by somebody else, and so we're trying to make sure that the social equity partner is a real partner.
That was a catch-22 here in New Haven, because there was a woman of color who was in the business of medical marijuana, but she said, because I'm black, I can't get the loan. So she partnered with one of those wealthy national companies, and she got denied a license because they said, you're a front for them. She said, I'm not a front. That's a tough question. And he said, I'm not a front. I get to run it.
And that continues to be a problem because marijuana is still illegal at the federal level. So people cannot use the conventional banking system to get loans because, banks are federally regulated, and they are now they would be violating federal law if they gave loans for that purposes. So that's why you have to go to other equity markets, which often beginning entrepreneurs don't have access.
They're not social equity markets; they're equity markets.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
and that's another example of a measure you need to go year after year to push to pass. What about sports betting, internet gaming? You got that passed. How does that work?
Right.
out?
Similar with that. I think that's going to grow and expand. And again, we have to monitor that closely for abuses and also as to whether or not people are being lured into bad gambling habits as a result of that. But it was important for us to adopt that. And I'll tell you one story about that. When New Jersey was doing that, and all of a sudden they were legalizing sports betting, and all of a sudden the major professional sports were saying, well, we need to get a cut of this now because we're going to have to put on more security and be vigilant about crime and all of this. And Steve Sweeney, who was then the president pro tem in New Jersey, called me and said, what a bunch of crap this is, because these people, they seem, now all of a sudden they're saying they need to get money in order to do better policing, and they seem not to be worried about it when the only people who were messing with betting were organized crime. But all of a sudden, when the state is going to be doing it, all of a sudden they're worried about corruption. So he said, don't give them a dime. Don't cut them in for any portion of what you might get out of this.
All right. So Marty, before I let you go, 43 years in office, what has changed the most?
Well, I think what's changed the most is the nature of constituent communication. Is that now emails, texts. Previous when I first started, it was just phone calls and letters that people would get. So just the nature of communication has changed. I think also the parties now I think are more ideologically defined also than they were then.
They're not as much coalitions, right? Broad-based. The coalition on a set of issues, right?
Right.
And what about your belief in the government's ability to accomplish important goals and improve lives?
I continue to believe strongly in government's ability to accomplish goals. That a principled, well-run government can be a great force for good in the lives of the people. And I believe that when I first ran. I believe it now. And that's I'm at the opposite pole from Senator Sampson, who in a floor debate in the Senate one time said, he said, I can't wait for the day when the people of Connecticut won't have to pay any attention at all to what we do up here. Our role will be so minimal, so marginalized, that they can ignore what we do and it won't impact them at all. It's sort of like part of the Grover Norquist argument about I can't wait till government is so small that I can strangle it in the bathtub.
You believe government is we. Government is we the people, in your view.
Yes, I believe government is we the people.
Together.
I mean, FDR still my hero, and Lyndon Johnson, apart from his Vietnam policy. Those are the things that work. That's when government, I think, was working at its best in terms of meeting the needs of the people, and also recognizing that there are some people who do need help, that are not able to be self-sufficient and need assistance, and that assistance needs to come from the government in many cases.
Martin Looney, thanks for updating us on fighting the good fight.
You're welcome, Paul. Always great to be with you.
Congratulations again to another session. Thanks to Harry Droz behind the controls. We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience performing I Wish I Knew How It Feel to Be Free from the group CD, A Plea for Peace. This is Paul Bass inviting you to fly free with us all day and all night long at WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.